Hi there. This presentation aims to look at evaluating enabling environments. So, COVID has inevitably had an impact across the board, but as providers of early learning and childcare, there's an expectation for us to ensure continuity of a wide range of experiences on offer. Now, this is the same whether it be during a lockdown or during regular COVID times. Ultimately, national and local guidance must be adhered to, as well as following any policies or procedures set out by head of centre or manager or indeed your company. Um, and whilst obviously there have been massive challenges in terms of us having to create bubbles and rearrange playrooms, and also having certain aspects of practice that we've worked so hard to embed, particularly certain free flow between rooms perhaps, or indoor and outdoor, which might not be possible should your bubbles be restricted to different playrooms, and also lots of snack related independence skills that we worked really hard to support children in developing. But I think it has in many ways afforded us the opportunity to really get to know our children better by being in those smaller bubbles. And it's made us really have to stop and think about what learning opportunities and experiences that we're offering. Um, I think initially cleaning was and remains a kind of central worry to obviously to reduce the possibility of transmission via the resources that we have out. But I think we're now a lot more confident in the systems that we have in place, and we're aware that we need to think outside the box and still ensure that children have access to a variety of continuous and enhanced provision that will spark their curiosity, creativity, and encourage them to investigate and discover so that obviously their skills and their learning develops and progresses. Okay, so if we look at the learning environment and the setup of it, generally speaking, the playroom and probably the outdoors to certainly to an extent would be set up into zones or areas. Now, within these, there would be an element of continuous provision, which, whilst it's your kind of everyday, your bread and butter, the things that children have free, ready access to, it shouldn't be assumed that that remains the same throughout. There should be elements of change within that, particularly as the academic session goes on, as it were, because this should obviously develop as children's skills develop. So, what's there in August shouldn't necessarily be there in January because there would be an expectation that their skills would have come on. Um, there should be enhancements to this provision as well, based on either, I suppose, the skills that you see children have or what they need, or if you've been observing them during a perhaps a child-led or indeed adult-initiated or adult-led experience, and you might identify something that would deepen or broaden that learning, that can be added in as appropriate. Now, obviously, some of that we do have to consider COVID-19 guidance and restrictions, perhaps if you're talking maybe materials and things, but again, providing you have got strict cleaning procedures in place and rotation of things, then it shouldn't be a problem. But obviously, just beware that we need to ensure that we're following the guidance. Now, the environment will always be set up to suit your centre's own context and will look very different from setting to setting, and probably more so now because of the guidance, because we have had to rethink our playrooms and adapt. But it's not to say that there is any one way, or indeed that it needs to be fixed. It can be fluid, and if you are using zones, these can flow. They don't always have to remain the same, and likely your areas can move as well based on your observations of how they're being used, or are they being utilised correctly, as it were. Are children visiting them? Is it perhaps the specific space you've chosen, or is it what's in there? Um, and there obviously should be adult led experiences and activities going on, so pre planned things based on what you want children to learn or something that you've seen that you need to support them developing. There should be provocations out to kind of entice and provoke curiosity and discovery, investigation, and often you may well have an idea as to what the outcome is going to be, but as we'll cover in a different session, it's okay if that's not what happens, but it's important for you to try and watch how children engage and interact with these provocations and try and fathom what it is they are getting from it and where you need to take them. There, as we always say, there needs to be an equal balance of adult and child-led learning also. So these are basically what every learning environment should have in some way or another, but as mentioned, they won't all be the same. So if we just take a little minute to consider what exactly continuous provision is. So basically, continuous provision is the resources that are offered to children as part of an enabling environment. Now, these are usually set up within your learning areas or your learning zones. They're resources that children can explore independently and do so in a variety of ways. They should be stimulating and engaging, include provocations for learning. They should enable children to demonstrate their learning, give opportunities for children to revisit previous learning. The provision, as already mentioned, should be enhanced and adapted as learning progresses, and they should ultimately always offer challenge. So whilst continuous provision is there for children to independently access, the practitioner's role in this is crucial, not merely in providing the resources and rotating them and making sure they're there, but also in supporting them to interact with the resources, to engage with them, to model correct ways of using them, maybe to support or encourage ways that they could be used, and also to be making careful observations of children whilst they're using these. This then in turn informs planning and also planning of future continuous provision. So essentially this is referred to as the cycle of provision. And practitioners can also support children in engaging with this provision by effective use of open-ended questioning and interaction techniques to engage the children in conversations and to prompt their creative thinking and to try and again understand where it is they are, if you like, and where it is that the practitioner needs to support them in getting further. So at the very beginning of the presentation, I mentioned continuous provision overviews or continuous provision planners, which were developed by the early level support teacher team back a number of years ago. They were adapted from a format originally found on TESS, and we developed them to suit a curriculum for excellence and tie the skills into the experiences and outcomes. They've since been changed to reflect Scottish Government national guidance, building the ambition and latterly realising ambition. And we've tried to redo them with a specific focus on literacy and numeracy in each of the 10. Now, there are 10 to kind of cover the main areas of the playroom and outdoors. And we also shared these with P1 colleagues, and they are used and changed as appropriate to cover their snack, which might cover cooking activities, etc. So they list skills, effective practice, including interaction, resources, observations, characteristics of the environment, etc. And basically, what we were trying to promote was that if areas are set up in such a way, then these were examples of some of the typical skills that you may be able to assess, develop, expand on, and extend purely by children visiting these areas because they were well thought out and well set up. They include examples of elements of practice or interactions you might consider using, and some examples of possible observations that you may want to note. Now, these continuous provision planners or overviews are merely a starting point for practitioners. They're not an exhaustive list or indeed an audit by any stretch of the imagination, but they're a tool to support you in thinking about your provision. It's to help you consider what should your environment look like, what types of resources should it contain, what might engage children, what might have an impact on their learning, and I suppose to think about where your wow factor might be this week. It might be that you are focusing on a specific area of your playroom, or indeed each person may rotate areas or whatever, and it was just basically a way of you thinking about everything that that area or that zone should have within it. They fully support the theory that the environment is the third teacher, which is the philosophy promoted by Malaguzzi, among others. And they also support the Reggio Emilia approach that holds the premise that children develop through their interactions. Firstly, with adults, so their parents, their teachers, early years practitioners. Then next, with their peers, and then ultimately with the environment. So, what is an enabling environment? An enabling environment caters for individual interests. It has open-ended resources and loose parts that can be picked up and used by children, can be turned into a million different things that helps each individual child follow their own interests. So they're not limited to set things. Now, ways to do this might be to include scarves and loose material um, in your role play area as opposed to purely having princess, police, wizard costumes, because children can pick it up and let their imagination run wild and they can be whatever they want to be. With regards to block play, again, that it's open ended, it could be whatever, there is no limit. Cardboard boxes as well can be anything a child wants them to be, whereas if we have in our small world or any specific area, if we have set plastic garages or castles, that's all they can be. So it's trying to think about having a variety of high quality open ended resources that allow children to imagine and to create and to be curious and to discover and to just take their learning where they want it to go. It's about thinking that less is more. Sometimes we put out too much because we're trying to cater for everyone and it becomes a little bit overwhelming. So it's trying to ensure that tables and sand and water trays are mostly clear of resources actually, but have open shelving or trays containing the resources on display nearby. Now, often it's helpful if these themselves are loose parts or containers that can be used too. Um, it's thinking about a workshop setup, so resources are clearly labelled and they're completely accessible to children. They're stocked up, they're tidy, they're available for children to choose rather than adult always leaving out, because what tends to happen is then children will just use what is left out, which is fine. However, by having this workshop set up where everything is just there for children and they know they're okay to get it, it gives children control of their learning, and it does also support, although you do need to teach children first, but it supports them in gaining responsibility and looking after resources as well. Within an enabling environment, calm and neutral displays should be employed, they should be simple, and the idea there is that the resources and the provision and children's work that you may put up on the wall pops rather than being bright walls and bright tables and bright resources everywhere. Another key aspect is authenticity. So it's looking to try and really incorporate and include authentic resources and real experiences where possible. So, for instance, having real food as opposed to plastic, because obviously, if a child, if in the home corner it's only plastic fruit and a child maybe hasn't tried that, that's their only experience of what a banana is. About having real tools, think about the fine motor skills that children gain from using real screwdrivers, real nails, real hammers. So real bricks. Again, obviously there are elements of risk here, so it's about looking at risk benefit and I suppose, educate parents as well to try and get them on board here about the learning, the great learning opportunities that this affords children. Having shells maybe in the sand area. Now, the next one is a little bit controversial, but a lot of centres do still have a maths area. However, it's not necessary to have it, but whether or not you do, number should be happening in all areas of the nursery. And again, that is why we try to relook at the continuous provision planners to highlight literacy and numeracy within every area. Literacy again should be across all areas of the nursery. So think about the texts that are in each of your areas, the books in the kitchen or home corner, books for babies in the house corner perhaps, construction and reference books in small world. You might have architect plans, toy catalogues, etc., comics, supermarket magazines, etc. Children could maybe perhaps have a special jotter or a folder in an accessible place within the play area. Now, your story corner or story area should ideally be carpeted with soft furnishings, cosy and inviting, but again, less is more. Now, I know the cleaning of this in current times can be a little bit tricky, but again, it's just about having a really good strategy that you follow and ensuring that it is adhering to guidance. Outdoors. Now, we know, especially in current times, how important that is. And there were figures that showed that actually there's 200% more talking occurs outdoors than indoors. And we will all know ourselves, the little ones who can be really, really quiet indoors, but get them outside and they're like a completely different child. Now, interestingly, the outdoors should be different. We don't really want it just to mirror what's going on indoors. Have a think about things that can't happen indoors. So your growing, your mud play, your large resources to develop gross motor skills, investigation of the natural world, your mini beast hotels and everything. But it would be good if there is some sort of book area or story corner replicated outdoors, whether that be by way of a shed or whatever. It's important to ensure that we continuously monitor, review, and adapt. Look at how children are using resources and what needs to be changed and added to, what needs to be extended or reviewed. Again, as I have said a few times already in the presentation, the provision that we are offering should look very different at the end of the year compared to the beginning, because it should adapt and be responsive to the profess and the interests of the children. Okay, so here are a couple of examples of neutral backgrounds. You can see that the bottom left is very neutral. It's your kind of wooden community playthings type furniture. And you can see what we were saying before about displays and resources popping. They're kind of the only colourful parts. Everything's really following that kind of workshop setup. You can see that everything is kind of clear, or anything it is, it's very well organised within boxes for children to access. And again, you can see that things are labelled and they're in clear boxes too. The right hand side, interestingly, shows that neutral backgrounds don't necessarily have to be colourless. It's obviously a kind of pastel green, but it really picks up the earthy tones. You can see there are plants and actually kind of artificial grass in their story corner, but it is really calming. And again, the resources are the things that are popping there. Everything is really well set up. Okay, so this slide here shows examples of real resources. So obviously is us looking at authenticity. The typewriter and the phone are obviously particularly old school, as it were, but I think it's their unfamiliarity that's probably that much more novel to children and makes them want to explore it a little bit more. It really prompts their curiosity. It can give context to the numbers and letters displayed around the area as well, and it's also a really lovely way to explore technology from a bygone time. Obviously, nowadays you could use mobile phones and computer keypads for a more up-to-date approach, or indeed to compare life now as to how it was. The vocabulary that children would become aware of would probably be vocabulary that they wouldn't necessarily pick up in any other context within the traditional nursery playroom. Now, the pictures on the right, you can see that there are real tools in the construction area, and notice the books in there as well. They're relevant to woodwork. Again, you can see everything is really, really clearly labelled, and it's not overwhelming. Everything is quite organised. Obviously, there would be massive amounts of risk assessment and risk benefit approaches used here, and that then also allows children to understand the dangers, but also what they're learning, and to be able to talk about their learning as well, and why they need to do things carefully, why their fingers can't be too close, etc. And sometimes I think we kind of rob them of that. It's that cotton wool kind of culture. So having areas like this where there are real resources allows them to really get involved in looking at risk benefit. The bottom picture shows a home corner, and you can see that it's kind of deep crates that are used, and there's real food, there's real pasta in the lovely jars, and there's real kitchen accessories, and there's crockery, and the cups and saucers as well, obviously china, that allows children to feel what that's like, to know they have to be careful. Again, you're talking about riskier. If they're too rough with it, then it's going to break. Rather than us just using plastic within there, it really opens up the learning for them, and again develops vocabulary and allows them to kind of learn through their senses as well. So these three images on this slide show the examples of the workshop setup that we discussed. As you can see, all of the resources are in containers or tubs and they're labelled with a picture. They don't necessarily have to be as organised and as regimented as this, but I think there certainly should be areas like this around the playroom where children know exactly where to find the resources and exactly where to put them back. I guess to make them even more accessible to children, it might be an idea to use the clear boxes as opposed to the coloured ones, and that way they can see exactly what's inside. Here are some examples of story corners. Now, as we said, these should be cosy and inviting. They should be calm spaces that encourage children to be able to leave the busyness of the rest of the playroom and come inside and escape into a story. So we have to consider, are ours like that? Do they allow that? Do they have low lighting and soft furnishings with the resources such as these story shelves that allow children to interact, retell, or perhaps make up their own story and to really enter into it through their play? Sometimes we try and put out too many texts, and again, it gets back to that theme of just being overwhelming, and then books ends up strewn everywhere. What we say is if we have no more than a dozen really good quality books, but sometimes that might be too much. If you look at what's in these examples, they're beautifully set up. You can see that there are little props, there are little story spoons, little characters, puppets, and things that would really encourage children to understand and really engage in that story, and to, as I've already mentioned, maybe retell or create their own story using these. So here we have examples of deconstructed role play. Now, as you can see, the picture on the left shows the clothing rail, and there are lots of just basically clothes. There are tops and blouses, hats, and the little suitcase down the bottom. There are different scarves and such. There's jumpers. It's really, really inviting, and you can see how children would be encouraged to create their own characters or just to follow their own lead, and you could really see how they could get a proper role play situation going on from that. Um, it's not just about having open-ended clothes in terms of dress up, but also the large loose parts, which I did refer to earlier. So if you look at the other picture, top right, you'll see there are obviously big tires, and on that there's loads of really little loose parts that could be used in a million and one different ways. There are cardboard boxes around, there are little building bridges, there are tree slices, there are little plastic guttering. There's loads and loads of different things, but basically it's about being really creative, setting these out. It might be that you have to set up a provocation to begin with to give children a little example as to how they can play with it, and to let them know it's okay just to do your own thing, be creative. But after a while, observing them, and they'll grow with confidence, and you'll see their creativity will also grow, and they'll start to really come out with some fantastic creations. So when we were considering aspects of the enabling environment, we spoke briefly about calm and neutral displays. Lighting was also up there. Now, lighting can really, really change the atmosphere in the playroom. I'm sure you'll know yourself, if children are really, really hyper, when it's bright, sometimes just dimming the lights can really help to bring them down. So it's important to consider that within the areas of your playroom if it is something you're able to control. You can see the large picture is actually the home corner, but it's got the grand sort of long dining table, almost like a banquet, which could ordinarily, you could imagine children running to it and being really quite noisy. But actually, the fact that there's the canopy over the top and the branches with the fairy lights, you could see how they would be settling down and almost playing, enjoying this nice meal together. It's calm, it automatically kind of promotes a sense of just calmness and relaxation, a nice nurturing get together, gathering place as it were. The top right, interestingly, is actually quite bright, but you could see how that could quite naturally lend itself to exploring light and shade and looking at shadows that would be created as children play in that area. The bottom right, you could totally see children just gravitating towards that when they need a little bit of time out. It looks really nurturing, really calming. Again, it's the effect of the fairy lights. It just really helps to bring things down and kind of slow the pace. So it's important to have different elements throughout and not have it all kind of one standard bright if you can. So it's looking at different ways to use lighting, whether you can't physically change the switch, but even if it's bringing in some sort of material that could darken a place, or bringing in fairy lights just to really transform different areas and give them a different atmosphere and a different feeling. So now that we've considered what the environment should be like, it's time to have a little think about how we evaluate the learning environment. With your team, take a few minutes to consider, how do you currently evaluate your learning environment? What different tools do you use?
So now that you've had a chance to discuss various ways in which you evaluate your learning environment, here are some tools that we suggest that you use to help you to do just that. Realising the Ambition, Section 6, that deals with spaces that children need in a learning environment. Children's own evaluations of the playroom. There's many different ways that you can do that with children, but children should have a voice in how their playroom looks. Fairy Lever's observations and the Leuven scales, with particular focus on the 10-point action plan. The EDC play audit. The Eckers scale, which we'll talk about later. Regular focused observation of play areas. The continuous provision overviews, although it's important to stress that these are not an audit. They can be used to look at your environment and your continuous provision to see how it can improve. And of course, documents like Higgy Space to Grow, and My World Outdoors. So starting with realising the ambition, and section 6.3 has quite a detailed set of aspects or criteria that they recommend children's learning spaces should have, and the kind of spaces that children need in order for learning to take place. There's no need to go into them in detail here, but it is a good meter for your play area, for you to compare your play area with this set of criteria to see if it meets these kind of standards. So in East Barnshire, we're used to using Fairy Lever's observations as part of our whole class screening, or as a starting point for our support for all processes. But we can also use Fairy Levers to monitor our provision. The best way to do that is to select 5 to 7 children from across your cohort of children from a variety of ages, stages and abilities, and then making weekly Fairy Levers observations of these 5 to 7 children, record their well-being and their involvement. And what this will give you is actual data on how children's well-being and involvement is affected, and therefore, according to Fairy Levers, how well these children are learning and whether learning is taking place within your provision and within your environment. And that data will allow you to assess the quality of your provision and the quality of your environment, and whether there's any adaptations that need to be made. You can then look at the Fairy Levers 10 action points to decide where and what might need to be adapted. These are the 10 action points here. You can see that it covers a variety of aspects, and a lot of that is to do with the provision or the learning environment. So they are a good audit of your learning environment, and a good way of considering what might need to change in order for children's learning and wellbeing and involvement to improve. Another tool that you can use to evaluate your environment is East Dunbartonshire Early Years Play Audit. This audit was first devised for Play to Learn in primary schools, but our team has taken it and adapted it for use in early years. The Play audit is divided into 9 main focus areas, and you can see them listed here. Each focused area has a number of descriptors against which you can compare your learning environment and decide whether it is not yet developed, developing, established or enhanced. That then gives you a list of priorities, either high, medium or low, that you can take actions and develop next steps for. And basically what you end up with is a summary of priorities that you can use to feed into your improvement plan, or that you can just make small or large adaptations to your environment. And this is what that summary of priorities would look like. And as you can see at a glance on this page, exactly what would be high priority, exactly what your next steps are, and a time scale. And you can see how easily that would feed into your improvement plan. Another evaluative tool is the ECHR scale, and ECHR stands for Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale. It's quite a comprehensive assessment of your environment and also the interactions within the setting. It measures 43 items actually under 7 subscales, and you can see the subscales listed here. The Equity and Excellence Leads from East Dunbartonshire have prepared a presentation on ECHRs, and if you haven't seen it, I would recommend that you do. It will be made available on the East Dunbartonshire YouTube channel, and it's well worth a watch as it goes into ECHRs in much more detail. Focused observations of play areas are something that should be happening on a fairly regular basis. Really, it's down to you and your individual setting what it is that you want to observe and what you want to take note of during these focused observations. But here are some suggestions and a template that we've recommended to people of things that they might want to look at when observing in an area. So you might want to look at the number of children or the number of adults that's in that area, what the children are doing, what they're engaged in, what are they not engaged with, what age are the children, are they mainly boys or girls, is the learning adult or child-led, what skills are being developed, what provocations are on offer, what interactions are taking place or not taking place. Are there opportunities for chat and for extending vocabulary? And what opportunities are there for literacy and numeracy in these areas? As I've said before, it really depends on each individual setting, what it is you want to observe, but do make sure that you're having regular focused observations of these play areas and that you actually use this information to improve your environment, that it's not just a ticky box that you have to do now and again, but that you're actually using the information that you're gaining from these observations to make a difference. So, having watched the presentation, have a think about how you want to evaluate your learning environment. What tools would you like to use? Where are you going to start? What areas do you want to evaluate? And what's going to come next? what's going to be your action plan from that evaluation. There is a shared good practice folder on Teams, and it would be really great if you fed back into that with a photograph and a short paragraph of any evaluations that you've undertaken and any adaptations or improvements that you've made as a result of that. So thank you for listening, and as always, if you need any further advice and support or have any questions about this presentation, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of the early level support teachers, and we'd be more than happy to help. Thank you.